I'm going to be talking about what I call the art of explanation. So this is a slightly different talk than some of the ones you'll be seeing the rest of the conference. So I'll be talking about, in particular, behavioral models as they relate to information security. So behavioral models are commonly seen in economics as well as psychology, looking at how people actually behave. And I think there are a lot of relevant aspects of it to security in general. So with that. So the traditional kind of phrase talking about financial markets is markets can stay irrational longer than you can stay solvent, which was said by John Maynard Keynes. Markets are ultimately reflections of like collective choice and beliefs and are often irrational. If you've ever read the book Manias, Panics, and Crashes, you'll kind of get what I mean. So even if you bet on the rational view, your losses might accumulate to the point where you can't actually afford the bet anymore. And a year later, for example, you'll be vindicated. There are tons of examples of this. I think there was one in the late 90s. It was long-term capital management dealing with the ruble. But in any case, my InfoSec version is you can stay irrational longer than you can stay uncompromised. So you as a defender do not think purely rationally. Therefore, even if you're currently uncompromised, it's likely that this irrational behavior will lead to your compromise soon enough. So what is behavioral economics? Traditional economics describes people as the perfect calculation machines, or what people call homo economicus. So they make rational decisions that constantly maximize their self-interest. Behavioral econ came out in approximately the 1970s to empirically measure and model how people behave. And it turns out we take a ton of mental shortcuts when we're making decisions and have a ton of biases. So for example, like everyone knows that rationally they should eat healthily for each meal to optimize fitness, but then things like, at least in the United States, like bacon, hamburgers, and so forth happen. So not everyone always optimizes their decision making. But this is also good from an evolutionary perspective. So like if a grizzly bear is running towards you, you aren't going to start calculating like the optimal zigzag path on which you'll run. You'll just go like, oh crap, and start running your butt off. So a lot of people in the industry kind of scoff at a lot of defenders who have this irrational thinking, but in reality, everybody has these biases, so it's a little unfair to do so. So cognitive biases are repeated deviations from rational judgment, largely based on subjective perceptions. So people are both bad at evaluating inputs for a decision as well as evaluating potential outcomes. So again, with diet as an example, someone may eat really healthily and then buy a bag of cookies for one night and think that they'll have just one every night as a small treat, but they're probably underestimating the amount of temptation they'll face and probably eat like the whole package in one night. So humans rely a lot on heuristics, which are simply put as like intuition, and that leads to these biases. So the most famous is probably Dunning-Kruger, and then things like confirmation bias, which social media has been known to exacerbate. Another one is short-termism, and then also illusion of control. So these biases are relevant in all areas of life, but I think particularly InfoSec. Some of the behaviors that seem to particularly irk people about the InfoSec industry the most are what a researcher named Dr. Raid in the US said, it's snake oil served over word salads, basically a bunch of stuff that doesn't work said in a very fancy way. So it's meant to describe the ridiculous claims made by products that probably perform better as a way in for attackers than as a way to stop them. There's also way more hype for APT or sophisticated attacks than the ones that defenders actually repeatedly encounter, like phishing, web attacks, or even ransomware. Like for example, the NSA director recently said that none of the major breaches over the past year actually used ODE, which is pretty surprising given almost all of the breaches have claimed that sophisticated nation-state actors have been the ones who have hacked them. Defenders also don't seem to learn very much from their mistakes. They keep getting owned via the same methods, but are buying the same products. Another gripe is that data-driven approaches aren't used very much, or as much as they should be used. So Etsy, which is an American e-commerce company, their team talks at a ton of different conferences, and particularly at length about their data-driven security strategy. But the rest of the industry hasn't really caught up to them and hasn't really seen the benefits that leveraging data can be versus kind of the traditional block and tackling approach. And overall, defenders don't seem to be trying hard enough to escape the cat and mouse game with attackers, kind of like the cat whack-a-mole that Daniel talked about. And so they're perpetually and kind of woefully behind. So my goal, it's not to say like this is the absolute church truth. It's to start a different type of discussion about how to fix the industry, but using insights from a different field that kind of covers everything, that looks at how people actually behave rather than how they should behave. So I've made my own conclusions and assumptions on these implications that these different biases have in InfoSec, but it's a lot more of a framework than, again, like a law. So I'd love to hear anyone's thoughts or conclusions and have lots of healthy disagreement in discourse because that's how progress is made. Then finally, I want the defense shaming to really stop. Defenders aren't stupid or bad. Everyone falls prey to cognitive biases. So it gets even worse when they're like really high stakes problems that don't have a very clear solution. So let's try to tone it down a bit. And then finally, if anyone wants to collaborate on an empirical study, I'm definitely game. So what am I going to cover? Probably the biggest theory, which I'll get to, is prospect theory. And then I'll also cover time inconsistency, dual system theory, and then a little bit about the nature of groups versus individuals. And then obviously, what can we do about all of this? So prospect theory, it's kind of like, there's a term in the US, the OG theory, the original gangster theory that launched the field of behavioral economics. It has a ton of implications, so I'll be focusing pretty heavily on it in this talk. So I wrote recently a long read blog post about it if you want to learn a little more in depth. But the main thesis is that people make decisions by evaluating potential gains and losses through the lens of probability, rather than looking at like a final objective outcome. So for example, if people have a 100% chance of receiving $3,000 or an 80% chance of receiving $4,000, and then a 20% chance of receiving nothing, they'll actually choose the first option because it's a certain win, even though the second option actually has a higher objective probability weighted outcome that's $200 more. But on the flip side, kind of like when you think about losses, if people have a 100% chance of losing $3,000 or 80% chance of losing $4,000 and a 20% chance of losing nothing, they'll actually choose the latter, which is different than before, because they'd rather have the chance of not losing everything. So people are at least pretty consistently inconsistent, depending on whether they're in the gain domain or the loss domain. So it's important to note that the gain or loss is actually relative to like a certain baseline people have, which is known as the reference point. And that's basically their idea of what the status quo is. So the four key components to the theory, first is that people set the reference point, to which I referred as their status quo, against which they measure potential outcomes. The second is loss aversion, so empirically losses hurt 2.25 times more than gains feel good. Third is nonlinear probability weighting, or the fact that people overweight small probabilities and underweight big probabilities. And the fourth is diminishing sensitivity, basically like the more that you lose money or the more that you gain money or gain whatever it is you're looking to do, you actually feel either a benefit or loss less and less. So offense for defense, these are my theories as to how this applies to InfoSec. So attackers, I would say, are in the gain domain, while defenders are in the loss domain. This means attackers will be risk averse, quick to update their baseline, and focus more on probability-weighted outcomes. And this is based on kind of empirical studies from other areas that aren't InfoSec specific. Losses to attackers actually hurt 3 times more, or 3 times as much as losses to defenders. So that's like a 6.75 times kind of multiple on like a potential loss for them than a gain. So it hurts, nearly 7 times as much for them to lose something as it feels good for them to gain something. Defenders, however, risk seeking, so they're slow to update their baseline and they focus more on absolute outcomes rather than probability weighted ones. By that I mean after a loss, they care more about an outcome that would return them closer to the baseline, even if that's unlikely. So I would argue a defender's reference point is a security posture in which they can withstand set Z of attacks, whatever those are. They don't experience any materially significant breaches, like something requiring a financial disclosure, and they spend like X dollars on products to meet minimum compliance standards, because those aren't really part of the equation. And an attacker's reference point is successfully compromising a target for some sort of cost, without being caught, like before they get whatever they need to do, and before achieving their goal with value of like a Y. So I would argue that basically when do defenders feel a loss, when do attackers feel a loss, and then a gain. So defenders feel a loss when they're breached with, say, that set Z of attacks that they thought that they could actually protect themselves against, or experience a significant breach. The gain for a defender, that's a little tricky given they're in the loss domain, but it would be from successfully stopping attacks that are not included in set Z. So basically those that they assume they can't stop, think like the extra sophisticated attacks. So, for example, an advanced remote code execution exploit involving a sandbox escape, kernel priv escalation, then a payload that disables endpoint protection products is probably something they can't think they can withstand. So attackers feel lost whenever they are caught before they reach their desired outcome, or when their cost, like X, is greater than their outcome of Y. And then they feel a gain if they spend less than they did before to reach that outcome, or have a greater outcome than what they had before. So, for example, you could perceive it as a difference between different attackers. So like a nation state versus someone that's kind of just blasting out a bunch of malware. So a gain could include exploits that work across multiple platforms, or malware that can be repackaged easily, since it's reducing the marginal cost of each attack, even if, say, only 3% of the attacks are actually successful. Like thinking about it that way, an exploit for a design flaw, architectural weaknesses, or logic-based vulnerabilities, it's usually cross-platform, it's reliable, versus something like memory corruption. It'll very likely take a lot longer to fix, so that all means that there's going to be a higher payoff for the attacker. So both sides overweight small probabilities, but it manifests in slightly different ways. In the defender's case, they overweight how much something like a memory-resident attack will impact their organization. Probably not much if it's a nation state. So in attackers' cases, they overweight how much something like EMET is adopted, or other security products are adopted, or even the difficulty in bypassing something. So they'll instead develop attacks with, say, like malicious office macros that have a higher chance of success. Once defenders experience a loss, they're a lot more likely to pursue risky strategies to get them closer to that reference point. So for example, the 5% chance of stopping a sophisticated attack is something they'd rather do than the 95% chance of stopping, the chance of stopping like 95% of all phishing attacks, which realistically is going to damage their business more. So the result of this, that tools that stop less sophisticated attacks with a high degree of certainty tend to be a lot more under-adopted based what you would assume given how much of the attack surface they eliminate. So examples of this are two-factor authentication and whitelisting. Whitelisting is a lot trickier to implement, but something like two-factor is actually really easy to integrate, and it's actually alarming how many companies don't use it yet, particularly consumer-facing ones. A kind of bizarre case is actually EMET, which it's Microsoft's free anti-exploitation tool. So it's one thing like your grandmother doesn't know about it, but for corporations not to have adopted it in Windows environments is a little odd. It feels less though like a hand-wavy magical anti-APT tool, which means that it hasn't been adopted nearly as much, even though it stops a lot of attacks. But what's kind of ironic is that when attackers saw EMET was coming out, they started adjusting their techniques, anticipating that it would be widely adopted. So that's kind of an example how attackers are more risk-averse while defenders are less so. Canaries are another tool that can help stop attacks from less sophisticated attackers up to even very sophisticated ones. And it's pretty straightforward as far as like a deception tool goes, but it doesn't get nearly the same level of hype as other ones. In contrast, all of the anti-APT stuff, for example, like FireEye, gets bought way more than it should given the actual impact those attacks have on an organization, and also the success rates are a little dubious. So for example, stealing IP won't have a particularly tangible threat on a business, but a password dump of like all customers' credentials absolutely will. Threat intelligence is another thing I think plays into Clausewitz's, kind of like the military strategist's passionate hatred for the enemy. So it's an emotional component that helps defenders make sense of an attack. And it actually makes sense because there's little chance defenders will go back to that baseline again, so they can at least get some sort of small victory. So the incentive problems, obviously, there are a few. It's really hard for defenders to actually know what their security posture is and have that situational awareness. There are no real industry benchmarks. It's actually hard to get enough data to have that level of situational awareness to know which attackers are actually successful and which attacks they're stopping. So it's not really, they aren't really sure what value an attacker gains from hacking them, which isn't great. That's why there's been a lot of talk about profiling your own organization to figure out kind of like what assets are most important to you. Defenders' reference points are also more out of date than attackers. So it's probably anchored to whatever they thought that their security posture was, say, 2 or 3 years ago, which isn't great. So in the meantime, though, say if it's 2014 as the anchor, attackers have had 2 years to kind of improve their techniques and processes. So that's also putting defense at a disadvantage. Attackers, however, can kind of tally their cost as they go rather than have that huge delay. And they can guesstimate kind of the value of a successful attack. It's a little trickier when you think about nation state and not something that's more of a tangible like money stream thing. And hacktivism as well, that's a little fluffier as far as what the benefit is, but it's still a lot easier to calculate. They have better feedback loops as far as what works and what doesn't. It's pretty obvious to them if they're successful or not, so they can more quickly update that reference point. But attackers also really hate losses, so they'll work a lot harder to avoid them. So moving into time inconsistency, which all of these are very related. So people's preferences change over time. Your current self is different from your future self, but rationally, your choices should actually be the same regardless of when the outcome will come to fruition. So for example, like you committing to something a year from now, your future self in reality probably will say, I don't want to do that anymore, but realistically that shouldn't happen. People tend to discount future rewards or outcomes following a hyperbolic curve, not an exponential one. So a classic example is the marshmallow experiment. So children are told either they can have one marshmallow now or they can have, say, 2 or 3 in a later period of time. Obviously, rationally, they should wait and get the 2 or 3 because that's better than 1, but in reality, very few wait. The bias can be good. For example, with financial risk, it does make sense to weight a financial return more heavily today because, for example, with an equity, you own some sort of shares in a company. The company may not exist in a year, so it kind of makes sense. So time inconsistency, information security. So everyone here is probably familiar with technical debt. Obviously in security, it's more like, okay, we know that there's this problem, but we'll make it secure later, which isn't great. Also preferring out-of-the-box solutions versus ones that are trickier to set up. For example, whitelisting. There's a huge upfront time investment in setting up kind of like everything you need for the whitelist, even though there's a huge payoff. So people would rather something that kind of is like a blinky box that you can just stick on the network and it works immediately. Also a big one is only looking at current attacks versus building in resilience for the future, which when you consider the underweighting and overrating probability issue from prospect theory really exacerbates the issue. So one thing that's kind of interesting to think about is information security as a public good. So a big kind of topic in the past decade has been things like climate change and what can be done to get people to be more aware of it. Environmentalism efforts have really kickstarted a lot of behavioral economics research into how we can start incentivizing people to care about the environment, which turns out is really tricky. So in these studies, what's kind of interesting is that who cares depends on kind of like different groups. So for example, everyone hates having some sort of delayed, for example, improving water quality. Nobody wants to have to wait 5 years in order for it to actually be improved. They obviously want it now. That's a pretty easy thing to understand. But what's interesting is people don't actually penalize like a 6-year delay much more than a 2-year one. It's basically once they have that mental account of, okay, it's not immediate, they end up saying, well, it's not really as much worth our time. And then another weird one is that in the water quality example, people who visit lakes frequently were actually more impatient. They wanted some sort of immediate payoff for their future visits now. But those who are involved in environmental organizations kind of intuitively cared more and were more patient, and also more willing to contribute to costs of cleaning up water. So what could this mean for information security? So if it is somewhat of a public good, and by that I mean, I do think in some ways it is something where, for example, when Sony got breached, it wasn't really them that had to bear the cost of the breach. It was more the people who were doxxed. Same thing kind of in this, in the ongoing DNC in the United States and WikiLeaks thing with the election. It isn't necessarily the DNC itself that got hurt. It was obviously Hillary and other people that were involved in the organization, even people kind of on the outside. So I would argue InfoSec in that way, there is kind of a mismatch between who gets hacked and then who is actually affected by the hack. So in theory, if InfoSec is somewhat of a public good, it could mean that you might as well pursue like really long-term projects on a 5-year scale rather than ones that are on a 1-year scale, because people are kind of equally as impatient about both. Things like employee turnover will only exacerbate the problem. I don't know necessarily what the work culture is like here, but particularly in technology in the United States, people tend to rotate every 2 years, which means anything longer than that 2-year time horizon to them, it's like, it's not going to be my problem. So they may be equally willing to work on that as something, that's a year. So those who use security tools more, in theory, it's kind of like the people who visit lakes, maybe they will be even more impatient because they want the results now. But perhaps even though security organizations sometimes get a very bad reputation, maybe those are actually good because it creates that sort of buy-in for people to care. So dual system theory, essentially dual system theory is saying that like in our brains we have 2 different systems going on. So mind system 1 is automatic, fast, and non-conscious. System 2 is controlled, slow, and conscious. So system 1 is very often dominant in decision making. It makes sense from an evolutionary perspective, like we needed to make snap judgments. But it's particularly enhanced by things like time pressure, busyness, and also positivity. If we're given positive feedback, we're more likely to trust our instincts more and more. System 2 is more dominant when it's personal or the person is held accountable. So, for example, if you know that whatever choice you make is directly, the outcome is directly going to fall on you, you're probably going to slow down and recheck your thinking. So in information security, I would say system 1, the instinctual one, buys products based on flashy demos at conferences. All the vendors here, I'm sure, are fantastic. Then also like sexy word salads, I would put it, something that, we stop all of the APTs, sophisticated, all the cybers, whatever, rather than actually saying what it does. System 1 also prefers established vendors versus taking the time to evaluate all products, even if they don't have tons of funding or they haven't been around 10 years, so forth. System 1 prefers sticking with known strategies and product categories rather than trying new ones. So, for example, in the EMET case, when it first came out, it could, even though it was produced by Microsoft and obviously integrated very well with the existing platform, it could be still seen as too risky versus sticking with antivirus that hasn't really been updated since 1998. System 1 also cares about ego. So a bunch of stuff recently, as I referred to the NSA director who said everybody attributes their attacks to sophisticated attackers because they don't want to be like, yeah, it was, in the United States, we would say it's someone probably from this area that is 14 years old, as Deanna referenced, or Trump's 400-pound hacker in the basement. Those aren't necessarily sophisticated attackers, so people don't want to admit it was just like one guy or something like that. That's part of ego. So a big question is, what about groups? And unfortunately, there's not a great answer, and this is a problem with behavioral economics in general. I would say it's only really been in the past 10 years, maybe the first paper came out 20 years ago, talking about collective decision-making behavior, like in groups and teams, rather than individual. So unfortunately, there's not a lot of evidence to go on. But obviously, it's extremely relevant to information security because very rarely is it just one guy. It's normally some sort of team. So basically what the conclusions have been is it either can exacerbate biases or it can reduce them. So in reality, we don't really know what it'll do. It won't be the same most likely. It'll probably have some sort of effect. But it's pretty clear that it offends a lot on your decision-making process, the types of biases you have, the strength of those biases, and then also kind of like the bias or preference distribution among your group. So obviously, if your group is very heavily weighted towards one sort of system of beliefs, like, yeah, we really need to go for those really tiny probability attacks, you're a lot more likely to double down on that. And then a big problem is who sets the reference point for the group. It would be nice if kind of there was some sort of equal anonymous voting distribution for like, okay, here's what we think the collective reference point is, but it's a lot more likely that it's probably going to be one person who decides it. So in that vein, a leader also creates social issues. So if you have one person kind of at the top of the hierarchy, that's going to create some problems. So for example, there's tons of evidence that if a leader states their bias towards some sort of decision, that tends to actually set the decision because people will want to show that they're part of like the in-group by agreeing with him or her. There's also some evidence that groups have stronger what's called escalation of commitment, which just means doubling down. So if they've invested a lot in, again, like a FireEye box, even if it's not working, groups are actually more likely to say, okay, let's continue to spend money on it and let's stick with it, rather than, okay, maybe let's try something else. I'd say the term groupthink exists, or hive mind exists for a reason. A lot of times being in a group of like-minded people can just continually self-reinforce, then also kind of continually narrow perspectives. And finally, groups are actually potentially better at self-justification, which just means like being able to justify one's decision on rational grounds, even if it's not actually rational. So it's worse in groups because every individual feels like the situation is out of their control and thus thinks it's other factors rather than their decision-making process that is causing the negative outcome. So the question is, what can we do about it? So improving heuristics, which again are those instinctual like biases, and say at an industry level, only hyping legit bugs or attacks, as Daniel said, like, I think he was talking about shell shock, like probably didn't need to be hyped. Something like Heartbleed was pretty bad, so maybe that's legitimate, but I think it's very unlikely that the logo trend for new vulnerabilities will go away, even though, new one's Dirty Cow, I guess, is pretty legitimate. But I think that's one that's going to be hard to change because that's more of the media. Proportionally reflecting the frequency of different types of attacks, which tackles like the familiarity problem. It's unlikely, but it's easier. I'm a big proponent of more data sharing to a certain extent to be able to get a better sense of like, particularly on industry by industry level, here are the people who are attacking us, here are their TCPs, like here's the vectors of attack that we're seeing the most. Which also gets into publishing accurate threat data and sharing security metrics. A lot of times it's vendors who are putting out these reports, which you can definitely argue if they're neutral or not. So I think having some sort of unbiased report would be really helpful. Then finally, at talks like these and everywhere globally, I think it's important for defenders to talk more about like the boring part of defense, the unsexy technology that really works. Again, I highly recommend checking out all of the Etsy security team's presentations because they cover that a ton, like what tools they've built that actually work. So again, yeah, cool internally developed tools that work really well. It's also important to emphasize. So changing the incentives at the defender level, obviously the incentives are pretty weighted against them, which is part of the reason why attackers often win. So despite what Daniel said, I do think raising the cost of attack is important from this lens. I think what that means practically is, what I would say is like, if you have kind of the spectrum of like, this is very hard to do, this is easier to do, like cut out the low hanging fruit. Yeah, like they're still going to shell out 1.5 million for an iOS exploit if they really need to, but at least you can stop it from like drive-by malware downloads or whatever, because that's way too easy and it's sort of embarrassing. But I think it's not just about raising the cost of the attacker, it's also decreasing the value of the outcome. So for example, having customer data just like in different silos rather than all just in one place, having strong access controls, having micro-segmentation in place on those databases is really important because that way if the attacker gets in, they also have to get in multiple times. Two-factor authentication is part of that as well. You can get credentials, but two-factor means that you can't just use them all to get tons of customer data. Also find commonalities between different types of attacks and defend against the lowest common denominator first. So for example, I think it was Fancy Bear is the new, I guess, name they've attributed to the various election hacks, and those happened still via phishing links. They were pretty sophisticated. It looked like, I think, a Google, your account has been, we've detected suspicious activity, reset your password, something like that. But it's still a phishing email, and in theory, they should be able to detect that it's like a bit.ly link and not the actual Google link. There's some products, particularly managed security services, that do that sort of phishing detection, but there's really not enough. But to look at, from the Nigerian prince scammers up into those sophisticated type attackers, like if you can stop all of that just by eliminating phishing, that's pretty impressive. Also eroding the attacker's information advantage. So in a presentation I gave recently about privacy too, I think it's important to keep things like HR profiles locked down, be careful about social media presence and so forth, because the more data that you're leaking about who's in your organization, who matters, who might have access to what sort of like servers you're using, the more likely it is the attacker will feel confident, like, hey, I can actually conduct this attack. So it's reducing their fear of a loss. So if you can erode that information advantage and increase like, hey, we're not sure if we can actually pull this off, it means they're less likely to attack you. Also, a data-driven approach helps you stay, quote unquote, honest. So again, defenders have really bad reference points. The more data you can have, the better you can say, okay, like I know that this reference point is pretty accurate. So leveraging attacker weaknesses, as I just mentioned, eroding the information advantage is big. But again, the key is attackers are still risk averse. They won't attack, again, depending on kind of like their reference point and different types of attackers. If there's too much uncertainty, it costs too much, or the payoff is too low. So keeping those in mind when developing your strategy is really important. So again, block low-cost attacks first, minimize the ability for reconnaissance activities, again, eroding the information advantage, stopping lateral movement through something like microsegmentation, again, just like basic access controls, limits the ability to like one-stop shop for them, which again, like reduces their ROI a lot. Then promoting system two, the rational way of thinking. So hold individual defenders on your security team accountable for the decisions they make, like the products they buy. Have them have to report like, here's how this product is performing, here are other options we could pursue, and kind of have that lens, particularly in case of a breach. Having that one person accountable is very important. So don't just check boxes like for compliance. Don't settle for the status quo. Don't be a sheeple and just follow whatever the industry is doing. Think critically about for your organization, like how can you make sure everybody in the team has a stake in making sure it's secure. Then also leverage what's called the IKEA effect. It's actually that people value things that they've put labor into, like building your own chair, you'll actually value more than a chair you've just bought. So that would imply building internal tooling, making sure that people on your team do more customization to your products. That way they feel like they really own it and then value it more. Then some other ideas, which I think are potentially farther off. So research has shown that thinking about each side's decision tree, like the defender's decision tree and the attacker's decision tree, actually helps slow down thinking and start thinking more rationally. Because a lot of times you can assume that the other side is acting in a completely different way than you might think. It's actually funny, people tend to assume the other side is irrational, even though they're irrational. It's very weird. So also the more people identify with certain cause, for example, the environmentalism to which I referred earlier, the more that they'll be willing to put in the time and effort and money into solutions that actually improve it. So I think more conferences, more organizations could actually be a good thing. Then finally, we need to try to shift more of the burden onto the actual decision maker, again, the companies, rather than having end users or other people involved with the organization bearing the cost of it. I have more thoughts on that, but that would take way too long, so I'll spare you guys. So in conclusion, my big pet peeve is everybody talks about kind of like game theory 101, everybody's a rational actor acting like a computer. That's not how people actually behave. There are flawed, irrational people on both sides, so we need to be analyzing it with that lens. Understand your own biases. Maybe there are attackers in the room, so maybe understand some of your own biases in that light too. And be vigilant in recognizing and countering them using some of the strategies I proposed. Let's also not call defenders stupid. Let's walk them through how their decision-making can be improved and understand the perspectives they have. And as far as further research, one of it is just, again, at the kind of higher level, behavioral economics level, there needs to be way more research done on group versus individual decision-making. That's not something we can really help. I think mapping out differences in attacker motivations might help us recognize when these biases might be amplified or reduced. For example, in cases of insider threat, Those that have some sort of ideological motivation are more likely to have kind of like a risk weighting function essentially approaching zero, like they don't really care what risks they encounter because they're fighting for cause, which is interesting to analyze. And then I'd love to work with people on trying to set up some sort of empirical studies, looking at defenders and how they actually behave, rather than just talking about theories. If you have any questions, I'll be in the speaker's corner. Otherwise, it's my email, Twitter, and then if you want further reading, here's my blog post. So thank you.